Hey y'all, Leela with Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel. Today's tumbler tutorial, I'm going to show you how I created this Halloween glittered themed tumbler that says stay spooky. This is a really fun tumbler to create and I know you guys are going to use this tumbler as inspiration. This was my first tumbler that I created in my new craft room, so bear with me with some of the lighting. I'm still trying to adjust with placement of this craft room and get the lighting correctly, but you could see everything perfectly fine, just there are some slides that are a little dim. But like always, all of my materials will be listed in my description below, including some direct links and coupon codes. And don't forget to find me on all of my socials, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok for more tumbler tricks and tips. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. I'm using a 30-ounce stainless steel tumbler from Maker Flow Crafts. I sanded this tumbler down with a 180 grit sanding block, and then I am now wiping it down with my 91% alcohol. I'm going to paint this tumbler mint green from Pop of Color CCDIY paints. If you want, you can spray paint this tumbler. It was just really hot that day, so I didn't want to go outside. So I just I painted 2 coats of paint on this tumbler, so you see me that I'm painting the first coat. I let this dry and then I painted my second coat before moving on to the next step. The paintbrush I am using is a makeup brush from Wet n Wild, and that will be posted in my description below. The first step is adding the glitter to this tumbler. I am using green tea and kind of a big dill from Glitter Heart Co. I do have a coupon code for Glitter Heart Co, 10% off Miss Kiss. And the way I'm going to apply these glitters is using the epoxy method. So I am applying about 5 ml of epoxy total on this tumbler. So about 2 ml part A, 2.5 ml part A and 2.5 ml part B. You want a very little amount of epoxy place on this tumbler. If you add too much, that epoxy is going to drown that glitter and your glitter is going to have a dull finish. The way I like to explain this step is comparing this to adding glitter with spray adhesive. Whenever you spray adhesive onto your tumbler and you apply your glitter, just a little thin coat of the spray adhesive is added to your tumbler, and then that glitter is able to stick to that tumbler. So that's the same with the epoxy. You want a very thin amount of epoxy because epoxy is very sticky, and that very thin coat is enough just for that glitter to be placed on the tumbler and stuck to the tumbler. And all I did was place both of those colors into a Dixie cup. I mixed them 50-50, and then I applied that mixed glitter onto the tumbler. If you don't have these colors on hand, that's fine. Use any color you like. You can even place clear glitter over a lime green background, or you can even choose other Halloween colors like orange, lavender, any other colors you have on hand. Once I applied my glitters to the tumbler, I let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for about 2 hours. I then turned off my cup turner and then I let my tumbler air dry or air cure for another 3 hours. So my total drying time for this thin coat of epoxy is only 5 hours. The reason why it's only 5 hours is because you're adding such a thin amount of epoxy to the tumbler, and your tumbler is going to be dry or cured enough to add that top coat of epoxy to seal on that glitter. So you don't need to wait 24 hours to apply that top coat of epoxy, which is the next step, to the tumbler. So we're going to finish adding this glitter, let this tumbler cure, and then I'll see y'all for the next step. And now that my epoxy is cured underneath my glitter, you can tell that I am now recording in the daylight. Look how better that lighting is. I'm going to add my top coat of epoxy. I am adding a total of 30 ml of epoxy. That's 15 ml part A and 15 ml part B. I am only adding the 30 ml of epoxy because this is not going to be the last coat of epoxy that I add on this tumbler. So if this coat has your glitter kind of peeking through, or you have little like bumps in your tumbler from your glitter, that's okay. We're going to add another coat over this. This coat of epoxy is going to act as the sealant for that glitter. So if it's not as thick, it's okay. The most important part is that this glitter is sealed into the tumbler with this epoxy. So I am going to let this spin on the cup turner for 4 hours. I'm then going to turn off my cup turner and then let this tumbler air dry or air cure for another 6 hours. The total drying time, about 10 to 12 hours, depending on your humidity and the type of epoxy that you're using. So I'll see y'all for the next step. So now that that top coat of epoxy is cured enough to move on to the next step, I'm going to apply 20 mLs of epoxy to this tumbler. That's 10 mLs part A and 10 mLs part B. I am going to add some alcohol inks to this tumbler. Here's a list of the inks that I'll be using. They'll also be posted in my description below. Now I know if you've done a alcohol ink tumbler in the past before, you know that you have to add a lot more epoxy. But for this style of alcohol ink tumbler, I don't want to add too much epoxy, and you'll see why. You don't need a very thick coat of epoxy for this type of alcohol ink tumbler. You just need enough to apply those inks onto the tumbler, because we're going to do kind of a different method. And if you've watched any of my previous videos, then you'll see what I'm talking about. So make sure you have a very evenly coated tumbler, and then I hit this with a heat gun just a little bit. I don't want to overheat the epoxy, because if I overheat the epoxy, then when I add those inks to the tumbler, the inks are going to spread and kind of dissolve in some areas. So you want to make sure you're not overheating your epoxy, but you want to add a little bit of a heat just to pop any of those bubbles created in the epoxy. So once I heat up my tumbler, I always like to wait a couple seconds and let it kind of cool down before I add my alcohol inks to my tumbler. And then I'm going to add my alcohol inks one at a time. Add whichever colors you have on hand. I wanted to add enough inks to show kind of like a stormy Halloweeny background, but I also wanted that green glitter to peek through. So I added my purple and my orange, and then I added about 5 little squirts of black. Do keep in mind, whenever you're working with black, it does take over a lot. And even in my opinion, when I was finished with this, I feel like I added way too much black to the tumbler. So you can always add more black than take away. It's harder to take away. And then once I finished adding those 3 colors, I went in with my white, and then I kind of just eyeballed where I wanted more inks and where I didn't want more inks. And then I just added it until my little heart was happy. So once everything was added to the tumbler, this is when it gets interesting. So instead of letting it spin and letting it, swirl, I took my gloved finger and all I did was finger painted. So I just had a really good time with this, and I just make little squiggly lines or Z's inside of the tumbler, and everything kind of mixes together. But you want to make sure you're not mixing too much, because you don't want those colors to look muddy. You still want to be able to see that black, orange, purple, and white, but you want kind of swirly. So whenever you're finished with this, you can wipe away some of the colors if you like, as I'm doing here. And then once it spins on the cup turner for the time it needs to spin, then it kind of swirls a little bit, but it makes a really cool effect. And I personally like this better than letting your tumbler spin and then seeing what it creates, because you kind of control the design. So I'm going to let this spin, I'm going to let it cure. I make sure to have a total 24 hours of curing time before moving on to my next step. So now it's been 24 hours and you'll see the cool effect that my tumbler has created. So I'm now going to take my X-Acto knife and I'm going to clean up the rim of my tumbler. I'm removing any of that excess epoxy that may have cured on my tumbler. I do this after every epoxy step. This just makes that final step of cleanup process a little easier. Once I finish cleaning up the rim, you're then going to see me sand the tumbler lightly with a 220 grit sanding block. I always start with a 220 grit sanding block for my sanding, and then if I need a rougher sanding block, then I go to my 180 grit sanding block. So that's exactly what I did. I sanded with my 220. I realized that I needed just a little bit more rough surface to sand. Then I switched over to my 180 grit sanding block, and I also sanded that rim. I sanded a little piece of that stainless steel to expose the stainless steel just a little bit, just to have a nice seal on my tumbler at the end. And then once I was finished sanding, I went in with my 91% alcohol and I wiped the entire tumbler down to remove any of that excess dust or any excess oils that may have been transferred to the tumbler. Once my tumbler was nice and clean, now it's time to move on to adding our template to the tumbler. So I measured my tumbler, and everyone's tumbler is going to measure a little differently depending on the brand and the size tumbler. But I decided that I wanted my design for this 30-ounce tumbler to be 10.5 inches by 6 inches tall. And then I realized it was a little too short, but we'll get to that process after. So I used my temporary vinyl and I created a scene, or a Halloween scene, in Cricut Design Space, and I used all of the Cricut images and I just created my scene and I welded the scene together. So I use like a Halloween house, I use a pumpkin, I use Halloween trees, and if you type in all of that in your Cricut Design Space, and if you have the Cricut access, then all those images are available to you. So again, this is going to be our template. So I'm not applying these decals onto the tumbler. I'm making a template, so when I spray paint my tumbler at the end here, what you see in blue is what's going to be black. So that's all I'm doing. So I'm kind of like, I guess we can call it reverse weeding, but I'm weeding the images away from that vinyl so I can have that template in place. What really helped me was keeping my image on my computer screen so I can see what to weed, because if you're used to weeding vinyl, then you just want to naturally weed around the image instead of weeding inside the image. So that also helped me by keeping that image on my screen. And you can use any color vinyl you have on hand. Again, I am just making a template. I'm not keeping this vinyl on my tumbler, and I am using temporary vinyl, so it was easier to peel up from the tumbler than if I used permanent vinyl. So once I was finished with, I guess, reverse weeding this section, I took my transfer tape and I added transfer tape onto this piece of vinyl. I've added this right onto the tumbler in the past, but I found that transfer tape is probably the easiest to do whenever you do this style tumbler. I've made so many mistakes in the past with these tumblers, but I think I've gotten it down. So once I applied my transfer tape, I'm taking my scissors and I'm just cutting around the transfer tape, and then I'm going to cut off the bottom of that vinyl. And I just want to make sure that blue is completely exposed so I can have the bottom of my tumbler be actually black instead of that design. And here's the fun part. So I'm going to remove the backing from the vinyl and the transfer tape, and then I'm going to apply this to my tumbler like so. I'm trying to make this as even as possible, but with everything that's going on in this image, if you don't have it as straight as you like, don't worry about it. You're really not going to notice, because like the bats are kind of like, you know, they're kind of crooked, they're not straight. So don't worry about if your image is as straight as you want. And then I'm going to slowly peel up that backing. This part was probably the hardest part, because when I peeled up that transfer tape, it wanted to peel up that vinyl as well. So I had to really go back and forth with pressing really firmly on my tumbler, peeling it up and pressing firmly. Thank God I fast forwarded through this part, because this video would have been an hour if I didn't. So just make sure you do this very carefully. And I want to mention that you see all the little creases and the wrinkles in this vinyl. That's completely okay. Leave those alone. The most important part about this vinyl is making sure that those edges are really stuck on firmly, because we are going to spray paint this tumbler, and you want to make sure this vinyl is pressed on so no spray paint goes underneath this vinyl. So I'm going to peel up this transfer tape, and then I realized the top was very bare, and anywhere that you don't see vinyl, that's where the spray paint's going to go. So I decided I wanted to add something on top of this tumbler, so I made another image in Cricut Design Space, and then I added it above my Halloween scene. Looking back at it now, I guess I should have made the image a little taller, but I think it all worked out, and I just kind of rolled with the punches, and it turned out to be a pretty cute tumbler. And now this is me adding my other design up top. All I did was I used some text on Cricut Design Space, and I just typed "stay spooky," and I added some like diamonds and just stuff like that around, like 4-point stars around that, just to have like some stuff in the air or in the sky. And then if you notice, I added a little silhouette of like a little cat. So that was obviously my favorite part. So that was really fun. And I added the transfer tape to this, and then I added this onto the tumbler the same way as I added that Halloween scene. Once both of my images were placed on my tumbler, I then took some excess vinyl and then I kind of placed that in those areas where it was blank, because everywhere where you see the green background, that's where that spray paint is going to go. And I didn't want those little lines to be spray painted. I wanted to keep those the sky green glittered like. So I'm just using some vinyl to just place in little areas to make sure I have a nice clean image. And then I added some up top. And then I went around my tumbler making sure that this vinyl was completely placed firmly on my tumbler, so I have a nice clean image and a nice clean line whenever I go to spray paint. So I chose to spray paint this black. You can spray paint this any color you like, any color you have on hand, and I just used a matte finish, but you can use a gloss, satin, or matte. It doesn't matter the finish as long as you obviously have spray paint. And I even thought about painting this, but I didn't want the creases or the lines on the tumbler. So if you do this tumbler and you happen to paint it, let me know how it comes out, because I'm really interested. Before I spray painted my tumbler, I always take my painter's tape and I just place it inside of my tumbler just so I don't have to worry about that cleanup process at the end. So I'm going to take my tumbler outside. I'm going to spray one nice even coat of my black spray paint on this tumbler. And then I'll see y'all whenever I come back inside when this tumbler is completely spray painted. Now that I have a completely spray painted tumbler, you'll see I'm going right in and I'm removing that vinyl. I like to personally remove vinyl whenever my spray paint is wet. I think that the vinyl is harder to peel up when the spray paint is wet, but it gives you a more crisp, even looking design and a more crisp like line or an outline, if that makes sense. I feel if you let your tumbler air dry and let the spray paint air dry for like an hour and then you peel up your vinyl, it allows your paint to dry over that vinyl, and when you peel up that vinyl, the spray paint will actually tear and then you won't have that clean line. Just make sure whenever you are doing this, you are being very careful with not bumping your tumbler onto items like I did, because your spray paint is still wet, and if you do happen to bump this on your desk or anything, it's going to smudge your spray paint. If you do have some areas that happen to be smudged or removed while your spray paint is wet, take your spray paint, take it outside in your tumbler, spray your spray paint inside of a tiny Dixie cup, take either a toothpick, a Q-tip, a wooden stick, and then dip your tool into your spray paint that you sprayed, and then carefully blot that spray paint with the tool onto your tumbler, and that will give you areas to kind of clean up and kind of like touch up in a way, instead of having to respray paint your tumbler. Another way to clean up your tumbler or to touch it up is if you are using black, you can always go in with some permanent marker and you can kind of shade that to make that blend as well. Once my vinyl was completely lifted, I realized that I put my Stay Spooky on like a black area of my tumbler, so that really blended. So what I did was I went back to Cricut Design Space, I added an offset to my Stay Spooky, I selected both the offset and the text, and then I selected Slice. That way I made an outline for the Stay Spooky, and I wanted that outline to be white to let that really pop, and then I added that to my tumbler. So I added my transfer tape onto this, and I added Stay and Spooky separately because I am adding this outline before I placed epoxy on this tumbler. So I'm adding this right after I removed that vinyl and my spray paint is completely dried. So be very careful with this because this is kind of risky, but I also didn't want to do one coat of epoxy add my vinyl, and then do like 3 more coats of epoxy. I like to really do all the steps as much as I can before adding those coats of epoxy. I thought adding this really brought my tumbler together, and then I even thought that this would have been really cool if I outlined the entire Halloween scene in white. I thought that would look really cool, so maybe my next tumbler I'll do it that way. So once I added the decal to the tumbler, I then went in with my CCDIY Quick Coat, which is a urethane sealer, and I'm only sealing my vinyl. So if I didn't have vinyl on this tumbler, then I wouldn't need this, but the fact that I have vinyl on the Stay Spooky, I use that to just seal in my vinyl. You do not have to seal anything else on this tumbler besides your vinyl if you are using your vinyl. That takes about 25 to 30 minutes to dry. Once that was completely dried, I then went in with my first coat of epoxy. You'll see that I'm doing 2 coats of epoxy on this video, but I really did 3. I wanted to really have this design locked in, and I wanted the bottom to be really smooth. So for this video, I added 2 coats of my 20 mLs of epoxy total, but in reality, I actually added 3 coats. This is going to differ depending on how many coats you want and how much epoxy you previously added and how bumpy your tumbler is. So I had some bumps from my humidity on the second coat, so I had to resand my tumbler down and then add my 3rd coat. But I let both of these coats cure, and then you'll see that I'm adding my 2nd coat here, and once my coats were cured, we're going to move on with cleaning up the tumbler, and then I'll show y'all the final results. And here is my tumbler after my final coat of epoxy has been cured. I'm going to clean up my tumbler by cutting the rim of the tumbler or removing that excess epoxy, and then washing the inside of my tumbler out with some dish soap. And here is my final tumbler look. This tumbler is so spooky, it's so cute, and I love that little black silhouette cat right there next to the Stay Spooky. There's so many possibilities and so many colors you can do on this tumbler. I cannot wait to see what you guys create. And if you like this video, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.